When Callum Strickland stepped between the trembling woman and three loaded pistols, he had no idea that the tarnished metal pin to her threadbare dress had once saved his life, or that marrying a stranger would prove easier than surviving their first night together. The auction block stood like a judge's bench in the center of Willowbrook's dusty Main Street, and atop it, a woman who looked as though she'd rather face a rattlesnake than the jeering crowd below. Ivy Lennox kept her chin raised despite the circumstances, though her knuckles had gone white where she gripped her worn carpet bag. "What am I bid for this fine specimen of womanhood?" Dax Monroe's voice carried the practiced boom of a man who'd sold everything from cattle to conscience. His gold teeth caught the afternoon sun as he gestured toward Ivy like she was prime livestock. "Fresh from back east. Got all her teeth. And I'm told she can read." The crowd of weathered faces and dust-caked hats murmured with interest. In a town where decent women were scarcer than clean water, even a plain-faced stranger drew attention. $50, called out Hendricks Barron, the banker whose wife had died of consumption the previous winter. His black mourning clothes made him look like a vulture circling carrion. $75. This from Tate Connors, whose ranch sprawled across half the valley. The man collected wives like most men collected horses, and buried them just as often. Ivy's jaw tightened, but she kept her gaze fixed on the horizon where the mountains cut purple wounds against the sky. You could almost taste the desperation rolling off her in waves, mixed with the alkali dust that coated everything in this godforsaken corner of nowhere. 100. Hendricks's voice cracked with eagerness. Callum had been watching from the shadows of McKinnon's saloon, nursing a whiskey that tasted like regret and road dust. He'd ridden into Willowbrook to collect a debt, not to witness this particular brand of human commerce. But something about the woman's stillness in the face of chaos made him pause. Then she shifted, and sunlight struck the small copper metal pin to her dress collar. The breath left his lungs in a rush. St. Christopher, patron of travelers. The same metal he'd pressed into a dying soldier's palm 5 years ago during the war, outside a field hospital in Virginia. The same metal that had been torn from his own neck by shrapnel, covered in his blood, worthless except for the prayer. His mother had whispered over it when he was 7 years old. The soldier, barely more than a boy, really, had looked up at him with eyes going glassy and whispered, "Tell my sister. Tell Ivy I tried to come home." 150. Tate's voice boomed across the square, and the crowd hooped. At that price, he wasn't just buying a wife. He was making a statement. Callum's hand moved to his holster without conscious thought. Tate Connors had buried 3 wives already, and the stories that drifted out of his ranch weren't the kind decent folks repeated in daylight. The man's appetites ran toward the cruel, and his wealth meant Sheriff Pierce looked the other way. 200. Hendricks countered, desperation making his voice shrill on the platform. Ivy's composure finally cracked. A single tear traced down her cheek, and she closed her eyes as if she could will herself somewhere else entirely. Somewhere the wind didn't smell like dust and broken dreams. That's when Callum stepped into the street. "Hold it." His voice cut through the crowd's chatter like a blade through silk. Every head turned toward him, and he felt the familiar weight of being watched, measured, judged. "I'll marry her." The silence that followed was so complete you could hear the wind rattling through the skeleton of the old church at the end of town. Dax's mouth fell open, revealing more gold than most men saw in a lifetime. "Well, I'll be damned," someone whispered. "That's Strickland." The name rippled through the crowd like wildfire. Callum Strickland, the man who'd single-handedly cleaned out the Jameson gang. Callum Strickland, who could put 6 bullets through a silver dollar at 50 paces. Callum Strickland, who'd been riding alone for so long that some folks wondered if he was more ghost than man. He stepped closer to the platform, his spurs singing against the hardpan earth. "That woman seems plain enough," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "But I recognize that metal." Ivy's eyes snapped open, meeting his for the first time. They were the color of storm clouds, gray-green and turbulent. In them, he saw recognition. Dawning, not of him, but of hope itself, fragile as butterfly wings. "The bidding stands at 200, Dax stammered, clearly trying to regain control of his auction. "Do you bid higher, Mr. Strickland?" Callum's smile was thin as a knife edge. "I'm not bidding." His hand rested casually on his gun belt, close enough to his Colt that everyone noticed. "I'm marrying her. Today. Right now." if there's a preacher to be found. Tate Connors stepped forward, his face flushed red above his silver beard. Now see here, Strickland. This is a legal auction, and I've got the highest bid. You've got nothing but wind and noise, Connors. Callum's voice dropped to something barely above a whisper, but it carried in the sudden stillness. Unless you'd like to discuss it privately. The two men locked eyes across 20 feet of dust and tension. Everyone in Willowbrook knew that. Tate Connors was quick with his fists and quicker with his temper. They also knew that Callum Strickland had never drawn his gun without finishing what he started. After a long moment, Tate stepped back. "This ain't over," he muttered, but the fight had gone out of him. "Preacher Morrison's at the hotel," someone called out helpfully. Callum climbed the 3 steps to the platform with measured strides. Up close, Ivy was even younger than he'd thought, maybe 25, with auburn hair that had escaped its pins and freckles scattered across her nose like cinnamon on cream. The metal at her throat rose and fell with her quick breathing. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat, "I believe this belonged to your brother." She stared up at him, those storm-colored eyes searching his face for answers to questions she didn't know how to ask. But before she could speak, a rifle shot cracked from the hotel's second-story window, and Callum Strickland's world exploded into chaos once again. The bullet splintered the wooden post inches from Callum's head, sending splinters flying like angry wasps. In one fluid motion, he grabbed Ivy around the waist and dove behind the auction platform as panic erupted in the street. "Get down," he shouted. Though she was already pressed flat against the dirt, her carpet bag clutched to her chest like armor. Above them, boots thundered across the platform as Dax Monroe scrambled for cover. Callum drew his Colt, the familiar weight settling into his palm like an old friend's handshake. His eyes swept the hotel's windows, searching for the telltale glint of a rifle barrel. "You hurt?" "No." Ivy's voice was steadier than he'd expected, though dust streaked her pale cheeks. "Who's shooting at us?" Before he could answer, Sheriff Cairo Pierce came running down the street, his star bouncing against his vest with each stride. "What in blazes is going on here?" Someone just tried to ventilate Strickland's skull, called out Hendricks Barron, who'd taken refuge behind a water trough. Shot came from the Grandview Hotel. Pierce's weathered face creased into a scowl. At 63, he'd been keeping the peace in Willowbrook since before the railroad came through, and he didn't appreciate his quiet afternoons interrupted by gunplay. "Anybody see who fired?" A chorus of no rippled through the scattered crowd. Callum wasn't surprised. In a town like Willowbrook, seeing too much could be hazardous to one's health. Windows empty now, Tate Connors observed from his position behind McKinnon's saloon. His voice carried a note of satisfaction that made Callum's jaw tighten. Ivy pushed herself up on her elbows, studying Callum's face with those unsettling gray-green eyes. "You said you recognized this metal. How?" The question hit him like a second bullet, one aimed straight at memories he'd spent 5 years trying to bury. Around them, the crowd began to emerge from cover, their excitement shifting from fear to curiosity. Nothing sold newspapers like a good shooting, especially when it involved the infamous Callum Strickland. "Your brother gave it to me," he said quietly, so only she could hear. "Outside Richmond, 1863. He was dying, and he asked me to tell his sister Ivy that he'd tried to come home." The color drained from her face until she was pale as desert bone. "Thomas." His name was Thomas Lennox. Private Thomas Lennox, Company B, 4th Massachusetts Infantry. The words came out flat and factual, but Callum could still see the boy's face, still hear his whispered final words. "He talked about you constantly. Said you made the best apple butter in New England." A sound escaped her throat, half sob, half laugh. "He always said that, even though I burned it every time." She touched the metal with trembling fingers. "I thought, after the war ended and he never came home, I thought maybe he'd forgotten us." "Forgotten me?" "He didn't forget." Callum holstered his gun and helped her to her feet, acutely aware of how small she felt under his hands. "He died thinking about home." Sheriff Pierce approached them, his eyes scanning the hotel windows one more time. "Well, whoever it was has made themselves scarce. But I'd watch your back, Strickland. Making enemies is easier than making friends in this territory. I'll keep that in mind." Callum dusted off his hat and settled it back on his head. "Now, about that preacher. Hold on just a minute." Pierce held up a weathered hand. You can't just waltz into my town and marry some woman off an auction block. There are proprieties to consider. Dax Monroe climbed down from the platform, his face flushed and his fancy clothes rumpled. The lady was being sold to pay her debts, fair and square. If Mr. Strickland wants to marry her, that's between him and the Lord. But someone still needs to settle her account. How much? Callum's hand moved toward his money belt. $217 plus interest. Dax's gold teeth glinted as he smiled. She came west on the promise of marriage to a gentleman in Silver Creek, but he took one look at her and decided she wasn't suitable to his needs. Ivy's cheeks flushed red as prairie roses. Mr. Whitmore was expecting someone more ornamental. Callum had met plenty of men like Whitmore during his travels. Men who ordered wives from catalogs like they were buying furniture, then discarded them just as easily when reality failed to match their fantasies. The thought made his trigger finger itch. "The debt's mine now," he said, counting out bills from his roll. "Along with the lady, if she'll have me." All eyes turned to Ivy, who stood there clutching her carpet bag like it contained all her worldly possessions, which, Callum suspected, it probably did. The afternoon sun caught the auburn highlights in her hair, and for a moment he could see past the dust and desperation to the woman beneath. "I don't even know your first name," she said softly. "Callum. Callum Strickland. And you're willing to marry a complete stranger just because she's wearing your medal?" The honest answer was more complicated than he cared to explain in front of half the town. The medal was part of it, a debt to a dying boy's last request. But there was something else, something in the way she'd held her head high on that auction block, refusing to be broken even when the world had stripped away everything else. "I've made worse decisions on less information," he said finally that a ghost of a smile touched her lips. "That's not particularly reassuring, Mr. Strickland. Call me Callum. And I reckon marriage to a stranger beats whatever Tate Connors had planned. For you." At the mention of Connors, her face went pale again. Everyone knew the stories about his previous wives, how they'd all died young, how the doctor never seemed to ask too many questions about their injuries. "Where's Preacher Morrison?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Right here." The voice boomed from the hotel's front porch, where a tall, thin man in black clothes stood holding a leather-bound Bible. Preacher Morrison had the look of a man who'd seen too much of the world's darkness but still believed in its capacity for light. As the crowd began to gather around them again, drawn by the promise of an impromptu wedding, Callum caught sight of a figure watching from the hotel's upper window, just a shadow against the glass, there and gone so quickly he might have imagined it. But Callum Strickland hadn't survived this long by ignoring shadows. He was about to marry a woman he'd known for 10 minutes. And someone had already tried to kill him once today, which meant the real danger was just beginning. The wedding ceremony lasted exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds, Callum counted. Partly from habit and partly to keep his mind off the rifle sights, he could feel trained on his back from somewhere in the growing crowd. Preacher Morrison's voice carried across the dusty street like thunder rolling down from the mountains. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here in the sight of God and this here community to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." Ivy stood beside him, still clutching that carpet bag like a lifeline. Up close, he could see the fine tremor in her hands, could smell the faint scent of lavender water that clung to her despite the long journey and harsh circumstances. Someone, her mother, perhaps, had taught her that a lady always carried a bit of sweetness with her, no matter how bitter the world became. "Do you, Callum Strickland, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, till death do you part?" "I do." The words came easier than he'd expected, though he kept his eyes scanning the crowd rather than looking at his bride. Old habits died hard, and staying alive required constant vigilance. "And do you, Ivy Lennox, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, till death do you part?" The silence stretched long enough that a few folks in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. Callum finally looked down at her, seeing his own uncertainty reflected in those storm-colored eyes. She was measuring him, he realized, trying to decide if the devil she didn't know was better than the devil she did. "I do," she whispered, and the words carried such quiet determination that something tightened in his chest. Then by the power, vested in me by the territory of Arizona and the grace of Almighty God, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Morrison closed his Bible with a snap that sounded like a gunshot. You may kiss your bride. This was the moment Callum had been dreading. Kissing strangers had never been his particular talent, especially with half the town watching and at least one person somewhere in the crowd nursing murderous intentions. But Ivy solved the problem by rising up on her toes and pressing her lips to his cheek, a brief, soft touch that somehow felt more intimate than any passionate embrace. Thank you, she breathed against his ear, so quietly only he could hear. The crowd erupted in cheers and catcalls, and suddenly everyone wanted to shake hands, offer congratulations, or share a drink in honor of the newlyweds. Callum accepted the well wishes with practiced grace while keeping mental track of everyone who approached them. In his experience, assassins often hid among friendly faces. Brielle Madison, who ran the boarding house, pushed through the throng with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "Oh, honey," she said, gathering Ivy into a fierce embrace. "Welcome to Willowbrook. You'll need a proper dress for the celebration tonight. I've got one that should fit you just fine." Celebration? Ivy looked bewildered. Why? We haven't had a wedding in this town for nigh on 2 years. Brielle's enthusiasm was infectious. The whole community will want to wish you well. There'll be dancing and music and enough food to feed half the territory. Callum caught Ivy's eye over the older woman's shoulder and saw his own alarm mirrored there. A public celebration meant crowds, noise, chaos, all the things that made protecting someone nearly impossible. "That's mighty kind, Mrs. Madison," he said carefully, "but my wife's had a long journey. Perhaps we should—" "Nonsense." This from Livia Whitmore, who'd materialized beside them like expensive perfume made flesh. She was the banker's wife, a woman who'd brought Eastern sophistication to the frontier and never let anyone forget it. A proper celebration is exactly what this town needs. Something to lift our spirits after all the unpleasantness lately. Unpleasantness. Ivy's voice carried a note of concern. Livia's smile grew brittle around the edges. "Oh, nothing for you to worry about, dear. Just some rustling troubles. And poor Mr. McKinnon's store was robbed last month. These things happen on the frontier." But Callum caught the look that passed between Livia and her husband, and he suspected there was more to the story than simple crime. In towns like Willowbrook, violence usually had deeper roots, feuds that went back generations, secrets that men killed to keep buried. As the crowd began to disperse, planning their impromptu festivities, Callum found himself alone with his new wife for the first time. She stood there in her travel-stained dress, looking lost and fragile despite the steel he'd glimpsed in her spine. "Well, Mrs. Strickland," he said, testing the name on his tongue. "I reckon we should talk." She flinched slightly at the unfamiliar surname. "Yes, I suppose we should, though I'm not sure where to begin. How about with why someone tried to put a bullet in my head the moment I offered to marry you?" The directness of the question seemed to steady her somehow. "I honestly don't know. I've never been to Willowbrook before today, and I can't imagine I have any enemies here. What about back east? Anyone who might have followed you?" She shook her head, auburn curls escaping their pins. "There's no one left to follow me. My parents died of influenza 3 winters ago, and Thomas was my only sibling. I answered Mr. Whitmore's advertisement because—" She paused, color rising in her cheeks. "Because I had nothing left to lose." Callum studied her face, looking for tells, the micro-expressions that separated truth from deception. But if Ivy Lennox was lying, she was better at it than most professional gamblers he'd known. "Then the shooter was after me, not you." He rubbed his jaw, thinking, which narrows it down to about half the territory. A sound escaped her that might have been laughter if it hadn't been so sharp with hysteria. "Half the territory wants you dead, and I just married you. Should I be flattered or terrified? Both, probably." He offered her his arm, a gesture his mother had drilled into him despite his chosen profession. "Come on, let's get you settled somewhere safe while I figure out who's trying to kill us." She took his arm hesitantly, her touch light as a bird preparing to take flight. "Us, you're wearing my name now," he said simply. "That makes you a target too." As they walked toward the boarding house, Callum caught sight of movement in his peripheral vision, a figure ducking into the alley between the bank and the general store. Too quick and furtive to be innocent, he was beginning to understand that marrying Ivy Lennox hadn't just given him a wife, that it had painted a bullseye on both their backs. And in a town full of secrets, everyone was armed and dangerous. The boarding house room smelled of lye soap and loneliness, with faded rose wallpaper that had seen better decades. Ivy set her carpetbag on the narrow bed and finally allowed her shoulders to slump, the weight of the day's events settling on her like dust after a windstorm. Callum stood by the single window, his back to her as he studied the street below. Even in profile, she could see the tension coiled in his frame. A man who'd learned that relaxation was a luxury he couldn't afford. "There's a back staircase," he said without turning around. "Second door from the end of the hall leads to the kitchen. Mrs. Madison keeps it unlocked in case of fire. Are you planning our escape route already?" Despite everything, Ivy found herself almost amused. "We've been married less than an hour. In my experience, it's better to know your exits before you need them." He finally faced her, and she was struck again by how his dark eyes seemed to catalog everything. The crack in the wash basin, the loose floorboard by the door, the way her hand trembled slightly as she unpinned her hat. "What kind of life have you lived, Callum Strickland, that you think like that?" The question hung between them like smoke from a dying fire. For a moment, she thought he might actually answer, might tell her something real about the man she'd just pledged her life to. Instead, he moved to the door and turned the key in the lock. "The kind that keeps me breathing," he said simply. "You should rest. The celebration tonight will be challenging." "You mean dangerous?" "Same thing, in this case." He settled into the room's single chair, positioning himself so he could watch both the window and the door. "Tell me about Thomas. What he was like before the war." The change of subject caught her off guard, but she found herself grateful for it. Talking about her brother was easier than contemplating her precarious new circumstances. "He was 2 years younger than me, but you'd never know it. Always trying to protect me from neighborhood boys or father's temper." She smiled at the memory. "He had this way of whistling. Could imitate any bird you'd ever heard. Cardinals, wrens, even meadowlarks. He still could, right up to the end." Callum's voice carried a gentleness she hadn't expected. "Used to whistle Shenandoah while we marched." Said it reminded him of home. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she blinked them back. "He wrote me letters for the first year, then nothing. I kept waiting, kept hoping." She pressed her lips together, fighting the familiar ache of loss. "When did he die?" "September 15th, 1863. Battle of Chickamauga." The date came out precise and final. "He took a piece of shrapnel in the chest. I stayed with him until the end." She completed the sentence he couldn't finish. "And he gave you the medal. Said his sister should know he kept his promise. That he tried to come home." Callum's hands rested on his knees, steady despite the weight of memory. "I've been carrying that message for 5 years, never knowing how to deliver it. And now, fate's delivered me to you instead." The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd traveled 2,000 miles to escape her past, only to collide with it in the dusty street of a frontier town that a knock at the door interrupted her thoughts, followed by Brielle Madison's cheerful voice. "Mrs. Strickland? I've brought that dress we talked about." Callum was on his feet instantly, his hand hovering near his gun. He opened the door just wide enough to verify the visitor, then stepped aside to let the older woman enter. Brielle bustled in, carrying an armload of blue fabric that rustled like autumn leaves. "Oh, this is going to be perfect on you, dear. Belonged to my daughter before she married and moved to California." She held up the dress, and Ivy caught her breath. It was beautiful. Deep sapphire blue with tiny pearl buttons and delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. The kind of dress she dreamed of wearing back in Boston, before poverty and pride had stripped away such luxuries. "Mrs. Madison, I couldn't possibly." "Nonsense. Every bride deserves something special for her wedding celebration." Brielle's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Besides, it's been hanging in my closet for 3 years, doing nobody any good. Sarah would be thrilled to see it worn by another young woman starting her new life." Callum cleared his throat. "Ma'am, we appreciate the kindness, but nothing, young man. Your wife needs proper clothes, and I won't hear another word about it." Brielle fixed him with a look that had probably cowed 40 years' worth of reluctant husbands. Now you make yourself scarce for a few minutes while we women talk. For a moment, Ivy thought he might refuse. The protective instinct that had made him step between her and those auction bidders was clearly warring with social convention. But finally he nodded. "I'll be right outside the door," he said, meeting Ivy's eyes. "If you need anything at all, just call out." When he was gone, Brielle shook her head with fond exasperation. "That man's wound tighter than a pocket. Watch. What's got him so spooked? Someone shot at us during the wedding ceremony." Ivy began unbuttoning her travel dress with fingers that still trembled slightly. "He thinks they might try again tonight." "Well, I'll be." Brielle's expression grew thoughtful as she helped Ivy out of the dusty garment. "You know, there's been talk lately. Whispers about strangers in town, folks asking questions they got no business asking." "What kind of questions?" "About land deeds, mostly. Mining claims. Some Eastern lawyer came through last month, nosing around the courthouse records." Brielle held up the blue dress, gauging the fit. Tate Connors was mighty interested in what he had to say. The name sent a chill down Ivy's spine. She'd seen the look in Connors' eyes during the auction, hunger and possession twisted together into something ugly. "Do you think he's the one who shot at Callum?" "Tate's not above violence when it suits him, but he's not one for bushwhacking. Too much pride." Brielle helped her slip the dress over her head, and the silk lining felt like cool water against her skin. "If he wanted your husband dead, he'd call him out face to face." The dress fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. When Brielle finished with the buttons and stepped back to admire her handiwork, Ivy barely recognized herself in the cracked mirror above the washstand. For the first time since leaving Boston, she looked like a lady instead of a refugee. "Now then," Brielle said, producing a small pot of rouge and a brush from her reticule. "Let's put some color in those cheeks. Can't have folks thinking the groom married a ghost." But as Ivy watched her reflection transform, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was preparing for her own funeral instead of a celebration. Because somewhere in Willowbrook, a killer was watching and waiting, and tonight's festivities would provide the perfect cover for murder. The Willowbrook Community Hall blazed with more light than the town had seen since the railroad's grand opening. Lanterns hung from the rafters like captured stars, casting dancing shadows across the rough-hewn walls. The entire population seemed to have turned out for the celebration. Ranchers and shopkeepers, wives and widows, even the children who should have been in bed hours ago. Ivy entered on Callum's arm, acutely aware of every eye in the room turning toward them. The blue dress rustled softly with each step, and she could feel the weight of judgment and curiosity pressing against her skin like humidity before a storm. "Smile," Callum murmured near her ear. "You look like you're walking to your own execution." "Aren't I?" she whispered back, but she managed to curve her lips upward as Preacher Morrison approached with his wife in tow. "Mrs. Strickland, you look absolutely radiant," the preacher's wife gushed. "That dress brings out your eyes beautifully." "Thank you, Mrs. Morrison. Everyone's been so kind." But even as she exchanged pleasantries, Ivy couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched by more than friendly neighbors. Callum's tension was infectious, and she found herself cataloging faces, searching for threats among the smiling well-wishers. The fiddle music struck up, and couples began forming for the first dance. Tate Connors materialized beside them, his silver beard neatly trimmed and his best suit brushed clean of dust. Up close, he smelled of bay rum and barely contained violence. "Mrs. Strickland," he said, offering a bow that was just mocking enough to be insulting. "Might I have the honor of the first dance with the bride?" The question was a challenge disguised as courtesy, and everyone within hearing distance held their breath. To refuse would be a public slight. To accept would put her in the arms of a man whose previous wives had all died young and mysteriously. "That's mighty generous of you, Connors," Callum said smoothly. "But I reckon I'll keep the first dance for myself. Being newly married and all." Tate's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in his pale eyes. "Of course. Perhaps the second dance, then." As he melted back into the crowd, Callum led Ivy onto the makeshift dance floor. His hands settled at her waist with surprising gentleness, and when the music began, she discovered he was a better dancer than she'd expected. From a gunfighter. "You're full of surprises, Mr. Strickland," she said as he guided her through the steps of a simple waltz. "My mother insisted on certain refinements." said a gentleman should know how to conduct himself in polite society. His dark eyes swept the room even as they danced, never stopping their vigilant patrol. She'd be appalled to see what became of her efforts. I think she'd be proud. The words slipped out before Ivy could stop them, surprising them both. You saved me today. That counts for something. Before he could respond, the music shifted to a livelier tune, and other couples joined them on the floor. Ivy found herself passed from partner to partner in the traditional celebration dance. Hendrix Barron's clammy hands, Preacher Morrison's gentle guidance, even young Doc Kiera Wells, who'd ridden in from her clinic to join the festivities. But when Tate Connors finally claimed his dance, the room seemed to grow quieter despite the continuing music. His grip on her waist was possessive, his breath hot against her ear as he spoke. You know, Mrs. Strickland, I can't help but wonder what your dear husband sees in you. His voice was silk wrapped around steel. Plain little thing like you, when he could have his pick of women. Perhaps he values substance over ornamentation, she replied, keeping her voice steady despite the warning bells clanging in her head. Tate chuckled, a sound like winter wind through bare branches. Substance? Is that what we're calling it? His hand moved lower on her back, fingers pressing hard enough to leave bruises. I wonder if he'll still value it when he learns the truth about what you're really running from back east. Ice flooded her veins. I don't know what you mean. Don't you? His smile was all teeth and no warmth. Ivy Lennox, formerly of Boston, whose former employer, one Mr. Jeremiah Ashworth, posted a rather substantial reward for information leading to the recovery of certain missing funds. The dance floor tilted beneath her feet. Ashworth, the banker who'd employed her as a bookkeeper, who'd trusted her with access to accounts and ledgers, who'd tried to force himself on her one evening after the other clerks had gone home, and whose advances she'd rejected with a brass letter opener that left him scarred and furious. He's lying, she whispered, but even as she said it, she knew Tate had somehow learned the truth, or at least Ashworth's version of it. $500. Tate continued conversationally as they swayed to the music. That's what he's offering. For your return. Dead or alive, though I suspect he'd prefer alive. Unfinished business, you might say. Across the room, Callum was talking with Sheriff Pierce, but his eyes kept finding her. Even at a distance, she could see the moment he registered her distress, the way his entire body went rigid, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. What do you want? She asked Tate, though she already knew. A partnership. You give me what Ashworth claims you stole, and I'll make sure no word of your indiscretion reaches certain interested parties. Your husband, for instance. The law. And if I refuse? His grip tightened until she gasped. Then I reckon Callum Strickland will find himself a widower before his honeymoon's over. Shame how dangerous the frontier can be for delicate Eastern flowers. The music ended, but Tate held her a moment longer, his message delivered. When he finally released her, Ivy felt as though she might collapse. But somehow she managed to walk steadily back to Callum, her chin raised despite the terror, clawing at her chest. What did he say to you? Callum's voice was deadly quiet. Nothing important. The lie tasted like ashes on her tongue. Just wedding wishes. But she could see in his eyes that he didn't believe her, and the knowledge sat between them like a loaded gun. Around them, the celebration continued. Laughter and music and the warm glow of community joy. Yet Ivy felt as though she was watching it all from behind glass, separate and untouchable. Later, much later, when the last dance had been danced, and the final toast proposed, they walked back to the boarding house under a canopy of desert stars. The night air was cool against her flushed cheeks, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. Ivy, Callum said as they reached their door, and something in his tone made her look up at him. Whatever secret you're carrying, whatever you're afraid of, it doesn't have to destroy us. She wanted to tell him everything then, wanted to unburden herself of the fear that had driven her west and the lies that might yet destroy them both. But the words stuck in her throat like thorns. Instead, she stood on her toes and kissed his cheek, just as she had during their wedding ceremony hours earlier. But this time, the gesture felt less like gratitude and more like goodbye, because tomorrow, one way or another, the truth would surface, and she wasn't sure their fragile new marriage would survive it. If you enjoyed this tale of frontier love and dangerous secrets, Don't forget to like this story and subscribe for more Wild West romance adventures. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today?